In the year 1670, a ship named the Carolina arrived at the untouched lands of South Carolina. Its journey was not one of simple exploration or settlement, but a voyage that carried with it a dark shadow. From the sun-kissed shores of Barbados, the ship brought not just settlers, but a system that would etch deep lines of division and pain into the land. These Barbadian settlers, steeped in a brutal slave-driven economy, disembarked with a vision for this new world. A vision that was not of equality or freedom, but one of domination and exploitation. They saw fertile ground, not just for crops, but for the seeds of a system that would bind one man to another in chains. This was not just an arrival, it was an invasion that would set the stage for the birth of Charleston. This was the beginning of a brutal era that would shape the fate of Charleston for centuries. The destiny of Charleston was forever bound to the slave trade. Over the span of 2 centuries, an overwhelming number of souls were torn from their homes in Africa and thrust into a life of bondage in this new world. More than 132,918 individuals were brought through Charleston's ports, their lives commodified and their freedom stolen. This trade, this buying and selling of human beings, brought unimaginable wealth to Charleston. The city thrived on the profits of human suffering, its economy blooming from the seeds of cruelty and exploitation. But this prosperity was a devil's bargain, an economic snare that the people of Charleston, much like their Barbadian ancestors, failed to see. The economy of Charleston was built on the backs of the enslaved, a fact that its inhabitants were tragically blind to. The echoes of this harsh reality still linger, a haunting reminder of a legacy built on suffering and sacrifice. The system of slavery was not new to the world. In fact, it was an old acquaintance, a dark specter that had already cast its long shadow over Barbados. This small island, with a history steeped in brutality, had birthed a system where a ruling class prospered on the relentless labor of African slaves in the sugarcane fields. The wealth of the island grew, but it came at a devastating cost. Thousands of African lives lost, families torn apart, and a culture systematically erased. This model of economic growth, fueled by human suffering, was not lost on the settlers of Charleston. They saw the potential for wealth, for power, and they followed the Barbadian blueprint. But as the wealth of Charleston grew, so did its blind spot. The cost in African lives, in human dignity, was overlooked, forgotten, justified. The economic trap had been set, and it was only a matter of time before it closed. In the mid-18th century, a religious revival began to challenge the established order. This period saw the emergence of Hugh Bryan, a wealthy planter. Yet Bryan was a man caught in an internal struggle, wrestling with the morality of slavery, the very institution that had built his prosperity. This struggle ignited a spark of conscience, a stirring in his soul that questioned the very foundations of his wealth. Bryan was not alone. This religious awakening began to infiltrate the plantation society, prompting others to question the morality of their actions. The seeds of change were being sown, yet the roots of the economic trap dug deeper. The wealth amassed from the sweat and toil of enslaved Africans continued to blind many to the moral cost. Despite this awakening, the economic trap continued to tighten its grip. The echoes of rebellion began to grow louder. In the year of 1739, a brave Angolan slave named Jemmy stood against the tide of oppression. Jemmy orchestrated the Stono Rebellion, a daring and desperate bid for freedom. This was not a hushed whisper of dissent, but a loud cry for liberty, ringing out across the plantations. The rebellion was a spark in the darkness, a beacon for those yearning for a life beyond the chains of slavery. However, the flame of this rebellion was extinguished swiftly and brutally. The slave owners, trembling with fear, crushed the rebellion with a heavy hand. Yet the echoes of this uprising did not fade away. Instead, they lingered, haunting the slave owners. The fear of a united uprising, a collective stand against the tyranny of slavery, continued to send shivers down their spines. The rebellion was crushed, but the fear of a united uprising lingered. Hugh Bryan, once a planter, now turned religious prophet. In the heart of the 1740s, Bryan, having witnessed the harsh realities of slavery and confronted by his own guilt, began to prophesy a future of destruction for Charleston. He foresaw a city brought to its knees not by foreign invaders or natural disasters, but by the very people it oppressed. Bryan's prophecies, although grim, carried a glimmer of hope for the enslaved. He spoke of a deliverance, a liberation of the oppressed that would shatter the chains of slavery. Brian's words spread like wildfire, whispered in the fields, murmured in the slave quarters. His prophecies became a beacon of hope for the enslaved, a promise of a future where they could claim their freedom. As the words of Brian echoed through the plantations, a sense of anticipation began to brew. These prophecies, rooted in guilt, began to plant seeds of hope in the hearts of the enslaved. Charleston, born from this complex history, began to flourish as a cosmopolitan trading center. It was a city that hummed with life and diversity, an urban symphony composed of voices from across the globe. From the Angolan dialects of the enslaved to the lilting gullah of the Sea Islands, the city was a linguistic tapestry woven from the threads of its inhabitants. Charleston transformed into a bustling hub, a beacon drawing traders from far and wide. The city thrived, its fortunes rising with each passing year, but this prosperity was a facade, a veneer that masked the truth. Charleston's growth, its wealth, its very existence was built on the backs of a black majority. The city, a symbol of cosmopolitanism and economic success, was a paradox. For beneath the surface of prosperity, a black majority lived in chains. As Charleston flourished, the economic trap tightened. The city's prosperity, built on the sweat and blood of enslaved Africans, began to bear a dangerous fruit. The relentless importation of slaves transformed the demographic landscape, leading to a black majority. This shift, while fueling Charleston's economic engine, also set the stage for a precarious balance of power. The white inhabitants, comfortable in their positions of authority, reveled in the wealth generated by the slave trade. They walked the city streets proud of the burgeoning metropolis they believed they had built. But beneath this veneer of success, a perilous reality was taking shape. The black majority, born from the ashes of human suffering, held the potential to upend the world the white Charlestonians knew. Yet, the inhabitants of Charleston reveled in their prosperity, blind to the precarious position they had created for themselves. The aftermath of the Stono Rebellion left deep scars. As the dust settled, the impact of the rebellion was etched indelibly into the psyche of both the enslaved and the enslavers. The slave owners, shaken to their core, were forced to confront the terrifying reality of a potential slave uprising. The enslaved, on the other hand, were left to grapple with the devastating consequences of their failed bid for freedom. The rebellion had been brutally crushed, and in its wake a chilling message was sent. Any future attempts at revolt would be met with ruthless and brutal retaliation. This brutal suppression was designed to extinguish the flames of rebellion, but it also served to stoke the embers of resentment and defiance among the enslaved. In the end, the Stono Rebellion did not lead to freedom, but it did sow the seeds of fear and distrust that would linger for generations to come. The fear of rebellion loomed large, a lesson remembered by future generations. In the post-revolution era, Charleston's economic golden age dawned. The city, cradled in the arms of prosperity, was no stranger to the cruel paradox of its wealth. The revival of the slave trade was a chilling testament to this reality. As the sun rose over the city's majestic buildings, the shadows of curbside auctions fell on its cobblestone streets. Here, human lives were bartered, bought, and sold, their worth reduced to mere numbers on a ledger. This resurgence of the slave trade was not merely a continuation of a dark legacy. It was the lifeblood that financed the city's opulence, the undercurrent that kept the wheels of prosperity turning. The grandeur of Charleston was built on the backs of the enslaved, their sweat and blood seeping into the city's foundations. The chains of slavery, temporarily loosened, were soon clamped tighter than ever. Among those involved in this ruthless trade was Captain Joseph Vesey. A man of ambition and cunning, Vesey was known for his involvement in the slave trade, a dark industry that thrived on human suffering and exploitation. His ship, the Providence, carried hundreds of African souls torn from their homeland across the merciless Atlantic, destined for lifetimes of servitude in the New World. This trade was not just a means of wealth for Vesey, but also a path to infamy. His actions would unknowingly lay the groundwork for a seismic shift in the history of Charleston. In one of his transactions, a young boy named Telemaque was purchased. That boy would later be known as Denmark Vesey. Little did Charleston know this name would set the stage for the life of a man who would challenge the very foundation of slavery, Denmark Vesey. The arrival of Joseph Vesey might have brought Denmark Vesey into the world of slavery, but it also sparked a flame of rebellion that would forever alter the course of history. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Charleston's dark secret, the genesis of slavery.
Like, subscribe, and share for more certified news.